Hello, and a very warm welcome to this latest episode of Venena Mundi. So far, in this historical playlist, we have looked at the history of poisons in ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Old Testament Hebrews, and China. We've seen that the use of plants and animals for both healing and to injure and kill was widespread throughout the ancient world, and happened for many reasons, ranging from hunting food to good old-fashioned murder, honourable suicide, and political gain. So you'll therefore probably not be surprised that things were no different in India. Why did Indian chariot makers fear the wood used in their construction? What personality traits did the Indians use to try and identify the poisoners amongst them? And who or what were the terrifying Poison Damsels? To find out, please continue watching this episode of Venena Mundi. The first Indian civilization arose in the Indus Valley about 2600 BCE. Its precise location straddled what is now the border between northwest India and Pakistan. Being highly experienced farmers, they grew wheat, barley, beans, and peas. They also raised cattle, goats, and sheep. Water buffalo were used for ploughing and to pull carts. These people spun cotton and traded with other cultures, such as modern-day Iraq. Many began to set up and live in towns, the largest being Mohenjo-Daro, which probably had a population of around 50,000, a very large settlement by ancient standards. We know they had a form of writing, but unfortunately it has not been deciphered, so nothing is known about the political system, religion, daily life, or medical practices. We do know, however, that the Indus Valley civilization peaked between 2300 and 1700 BCE. Then after 1700 BCE it broke down, the reasons for this being unclear. Perhaps there was climate change, and the area grew cooler and drier, or it has also been suggested that the Indus River changed its course. Whatever the cause, after the collapse, a new wave of people from Central Asia entered India about 1500 BC, probably through Afghanistan via the Khyber Pass. These peoples became known as Aryans, who at first were largely nomadic, with their herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. However, unlike the local tribes, they had chariots, which gradually allowed them to subdue the people already living in the area. By 1000 years BCE, therefore, they had conquered the whole area. The society became more ordered and local tribes became stable kingdoms. The Aryans became the priests, rulers and warriors, free peasants and merchants. The conquered people became slaves, labourers and artisans. In time, this stratified society developed into the caste system we know today. The Aryans also brought with them new religious traditions, passed down orally. Between 1500 and 500 BCE, these were gradually written down and evolved into a body of 4 texts known as the Vedas, meaning knowledge, using a written language called Vedic Sanskrit. These would become the basis of Hinduism, which is now the leading religion of India. At the core of the Vedas lies a philosophical discussion about the underlying cause of, the function of, and the personal response to existence. Accordingly, the text set out various spiritual practices that Hindus are expected to follow, including rituals, sacrifices, and observances, as well as benedictions, prayers, and mantras. The oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda Samhita, was written down about 1200 BCE and consists of 1028 hymns praising the ancient gods. Amongst these is hymn 191, more specifically known as the Watergrass Sun Hymn. It talks about various types of venomous creatures and how they kill by stealth and subterfuge. Allegedly, it was revealed to and written down by the ancient Hindu sage Agastya when he suspected that he'd been poisoned. Being a revered holy man, This has since turned into a Hindu practice where the repetition of the hymn is believed to be an antidote against venomous snakes, insects, and artificial poisons. Another invocation appears in hymn 50, which is a plea to several gods to give protection against the poison of the salmali, or the silk cotton tree, used in the making of chariots. Whilst the wood itself is not toxic, the fruit is considered poisonous. Other parts of the tree were used in various remedies, including the control of excessive bleeding and treating diseases of the urinary system like cystitis, and those of the kidneys and bladder. Finally, the Rig Veda also mentions the use of poisons in arrows, both for hunting and as a weapon in times of war. Indeed, the use of poison arrows seem to have been pretty widespread in India, first by early Mesolithic communities for hunting, and later the Rig Veda describes their use in war. Unfortunately, we have no idea what these poisons may have been. The word Allah is used in the Rig Veda to describe a substance smeared on arrows, but the nature of this is hotly debated. It is almost certain that it's not a mineral substance such as arsenic or mercury, but there is little certainty whether it is of plant or animal origin either. The next two Vedas contain no references to poisons, being almost exclusively concerned with performing sacrifices and the chants, hymns and mantras for singing during these ceremonies. Which brings us to the last of the Vedas, the Atharva Veda, which is probably the most recent, having been dated at around 900 BCE. The text essentially consists of a compendium of spells, charms and magical formulae. The treatment of poisons features quite prominently amongst these, including the recipes for antidotes against poison arrows and how to treat their resulting wounds. There is also possible reference to the nature of the poison itself, namely as tubers of the aconite plant, as one possible source. Otherwise, the Veda contains several chapters on dealing with bites from venomous snakes and insects, and cures for more general types of poisoning. Significantly, none of the Vedas specifically contains recipes for making poisons, although between them, the four texts mention at least 75 poisonous and non-poisonous, aquatic and terrestrial, domestic and wild, creatures, plants and animals. Broadly, at the same time as the Vedas were being written down, two other works of Indian literature came into being. First was the Ramayana, an epic work which is one of India's best-known tales. It tells the story of Prince Rama, an incarnation of the god Vishnu, and his efforts to rescue his wife Sita after she was abducted by the demon King Ravana. The legend was written about 2,300 years ago in the form of 24,000 couplets. It is basically the story of good overcoming evil. The fact that the use of poisons was already well established at the time is reflected by at least 10 separate references in the texts. For example, like the limbs of one who has drunk poison, my whole body burns with pain. Or another, what we gain by killing our kinsfolk will be like food which is mixed with poison. Similar references to poison are made in the other epic of Indian literature, the Mahabharata. Compiled from earlier works around 300 CE, it is a truly epic work consisting of almost 6,000 pages. It describes the war between the Kauravas and Pandavas, both descendants of King Bharat. The Mahabharata contains scores of references to poisons and poisonings, although a good proportion of these relates to bites from snakes. This is probably not surprising, since India is populated by at least 60 species of venomous snakes, so encountering them and being bitten would have been quite common, just as it remains largely today. Okay, so as we've seen, the only references to poison in India so far have been in religious texts and epic legends and tales. It's therefore quite difficult to separate fact, religious belief, and fiction. However, what these writings lack in detail and accuracy, they certainly make up in drama and excitement. But this started to change between 300 and 100 BCE with the publication of the first Indian medical texts, the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita. Both these texts attempted to systematically set down the various medical practices which until then had been mostly passed down by word of mouth. The result was to provide the foundations of Ayurvedic medicine, a medical regime which is one of the world's oldest medical systems and one which remains India's leading form of traditional healing to this day. The focus of Ayurvedic medicine lies on natural and holistic approaches to physical and mental health, meaning that Ayurvedic treatments combine natural products, mainly derived from plant, animal, and mineral sources, with a good diet, exercise, and a healthy lifestyle. Between them, the texts cover a multitude of health topics, including the philosophy and the practice of healthy living, the causes of disease, human anatomy, diagnosis and prognosis of disease, the importance of hygiene, the ethics of medical practice, and medical training. In practical terms, the texts describe hundreds of recipes for medicines and their use in treating specific diseases, including their preparation, appropriate dosages, and signs of abuse. The Sushruta Samhita specifically goes on to include a chapter on poisons. Remarkably, it starts by identifying the personality traits of a person likely to be a poisoner. As such, it's probably the first ever example of criminological profiling. It says, "He does not answer questions, or the answers are evasive. He speaks nonsense, rubs the foot along the ground and shivers. His face is discoloured. He rubs the root of the hair with his fingers, and he tries by every means to leave the house." Okay, some of these assertions are pretty far out, but nevertheless suggest that the people who use poison have a particular type of personality and have certain things in common, thus making it easier to spot them. The book goes on to describe ways in which food which has been laced with poisons can be identified, the different symptoms of poisons derived from both plant and animal sources, and the different ways in treating various types of poisoning. The text also goes into much detail about how poisons could be given to unsuspecting victims, including mixing with food, drink, or honey, and sprinkling over clothes, beds, shoes, garlands, or jewellery, and even the saddles of horses. There is considerable emphasis on the person treating poisoning having detailed knowledge of the symptoms of the different poisons and their antidotes. Not surprisingly, a large amount of the chapter is devoted to the classification, features and treatment of snake bites and those of rabid animals, especially dogs. Insect bites and stings also get coverage of their own. Significantly, although both the Chakara Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita contain recipes and treatments for poisoning, they do so purely from a benign point of view, and neither contains any recipes for the making of the poisons themselves. Returning to the subject of poison arrows, Hindu and later Buddhist texts, both from India, continue to describe their widespread use in warfare. Ironically, their use was common in India, and yet, as in many other ancient cultures, the practice aroused very mixed reactions. On the one hand, toxic weapons violated the traditional Hindu laws of conduct for Brahmins and higher castes, called the laws of Manu. These laws, recited over generations in oral verses, date back to around 500 BCE, and some say even earlier. They explicitly forbade the use of arrows that were barbed, poisoned, or blazing with fire. But no such concern was shown in the infamous book on statecraft, written by the strategist Chanakya for the Emperor Chandragupta. In it, the emperor's advisor advocates the use of any means to achieve political and military objectives. Written during his lifetime between 350 and 283 BCE, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, suggested using seriously nefarious means such as seduction, blackmail, the use of secret and concealed weapons, and poisons for political gain. He also urged always taking precautions against assassination, for example by using food tasters and employing all possible means of detecting poison. Once written, the work known as the Arthashastra was widely condemned as totally immoral because Kautilya advised the king to use whatever means with no moral or ethical limits to achieve his goals. For example, it described an astonishing number of methods to secretly poison enemies, including several complex recipes for creating poisonous weapons, reliant on snake venom, and other toxic ingredients. We will never know how many of Karatilla's recipes were actually put into practice, but the book's likely purpose was certainly not only to act as a poisoner's manual, but also as a propaganda piece to strike terror into any enemy contemplating attacking King Chandragupta. A couple of fascinating recipes include a potion of fireflies and wild boar's eyes to give soldiers night vision, and shoes smeared with the fat from roasted pregnant camels or the ashes of cremated children to allegedly let them walk for hundreds of miles without fatigue. Notably, Kayatilla also provided details of various antidotes for these toxic weapons, in case they backfired on the emperor's own subjects. Many of these were based on Sushruta Samhita we have met earlier. Water that had been polluted or poisoned, for example, could be identified by careful examination of it and its surroundings. Kayatilla thus wrote, "Such water is slimy, strong-smelling, frothy, and marked with dark lines on the surface. Frogs and fish die without apparent cause, and birds and beasts on its shores roam about wildly in confusion from the effects of the poison." Strictly speaking, many of these signs are just common sense. Once some form of interference had been detected, the water could be purified with mineral and plant substances and special rituals. It turns out that some of the countermeasures he proposed are highly effective and used to this very day. For example, filtering the water through clay removes most bacteria, and doing so through bonfire ash has a similar effect on poisons, being an effective form of charcoal filtration. Other measures, however, are a little bit more questionable. Thus, animal fodder that had been poisoned could be made safe by dousing it with perfumes, wine, the bile of brown cows, or by the beating of drums coated with anti-poisonous potions. Whilst alcohol in wine may have had some beneficial effect, the other of these remedies are pure nonsense. However, undoubtedly the most fascinating, yet at the same time the most infamous of Kayatilla's ideas, was the use of Vishmayi Kanya, or poison damsels. Whether these were real or just a myth is uncertain, but the idea is simply astonishing. Basically, a poison damsel was a beautiful woman who had a natural gift for withstanding poisons. Such women would be rigorously studied by physicians, and the right girl was selected from hundreds identified this way for this task. The chosen would be raised on a carefully created diet of poison and antidote from an early age, a technique known as Mithridatism. Many would die during this training, but those who managed to become immune would become human assassins. They would seduce their victim, and after gaining their trust, they would share with them food and drink laced with poison. Having developed resistance, the damsel would survive, whilst the intended victim would die from its effects. Another way was for a damsel to gradually ingest poison, typically snake venom, to build up such a high level of toxin in their bodies that any physical contact with them would kill the victim. Thus, by the time a damsel would reach adolescence, even the minutest quantity of her bodily fluids could prove fatal to anybody coming in touch with them. Legends say that these girls could sometimes even take down an adversary with a single kiss, although death was more certain when engaging in intercourse. The Sushruta Samhita describes these damsels rather eloquently. If she touches you, her sweat can kill. If you make love to her, your penis drops off like ripe fruit from its stalk. In fact, such was their reputation that even Aristotle got to hear about them in ancient Greece. In his treatise Secretum Secretorum, or The Secret of Secrets, he went on to warn his student Alexander not to accept any lavish gifts from the Indian kings, especially gifts of women. Nevertheless, an Indian legend suggests that when Alexander later invaded India, he died precisely in this way, as a result of embracing a damsel given to him as a trophy by the defeated King Porus. So were these damsels real or not? It's probably safe to say that most myths and legends have at least some grains of truth in them. Yes, women who acted as political agents and assassins very likely existed, and yes, they were versed in the skills of poisons and killing. But no, they most probably did not ingest poisons to build up tolerance, and no, They could not kill just by kissing or having sex. Instead, they were just women whose reputations grew through the telling of tales to a point where they were larger than life to what they actually were, resulting in them being portrayed as superhuman, where in reality they were just actual poor girls doing the dangerous job given to them, and many sacrificing their lives in the process. So, do we have any ideas about what these actual poisons were? Yes, some of them, but describing these would probably make this episode far too long. So let's end here and look at the poisons themselves in the next episode of Venena Mundi. Meanwhile, thank you for watching. If you like the content, please give it a thumbs up and use the comments below to say what you think or what you'd like to see in the future. In the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe so that I don't get lonely, and please click on the notification bell to make sure you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching, bye for now, and hope you can join me next time.